Hello, welcome to New Scientist Weekly. This is the transcontinental podcast where we select the best and most intriguing of the week's science stories. I'm Rowan Hooper in London.
And I'm Christy Taylor, standing in for North America in New York.
Yeah.
That landing bar just begun, and you can see the water below. And we have splashdown.
And that sound you heard just then was from the latest launch of Starship. That's the spacecraft that SpaceX wants to use to build a colony on Mars.
Yeah, that noise was the controlled return of the Super Heavy booster, and we're going to talk about that a bit more later in the show.
We've got lots on the show this week. For example, we have a heartwarming story of how gene therapy has restored hearing to 5 children who were born deaf. There's also new data on the side effects that people experience when they stop taking antidepressants. And I've been talking to author David Robson about how, with scientifically proven principles, we can enhance our social connections.
We'll also be talking about a new study showing that Earth's energy imbalance is even more out of kilter than we thought. But we're going to start off-planet on the moon, where physicists have proposed a plan to drill a 5-kilometre deep hole in the moon. Alex Wilkins is here to explain. Alex, is it drilling for cheese? We know it's not drilling for cheese, but why are they doing that?
I can't confirm it's not drilling for cheese. So we've had this decades-long quest here on Earth to find evidence of protons falling apart, or what physicists call decaying. Now, according to the standard model of particle physics, which is our kind of best model of how particles and forces work, protons should be stable and live forever. But the standard model has its problems, like it can't unite quantum mechanics and relativity.
Yeah, we hate the standard model, don't we?
Exactly.
We want to kill it.
Exactly. So physicists have suggested some alternative models which fall under this label of grand unified theories. And many of these models feature a proton that is in fact not stable forever, but can very, very, very occasionally fall apart. Now, all of our searches on Earth for these really elusive events have come up empty-handed, and we're running into the physical and monetary limitations of how sensitively we can look for them down here on Earth. But on the moon, it's very different because buried deep in the lunar rock, we might be able to look with even more sensitivity.
Yeah, could you explain how you can even begin to detect those kinds of particles in a rock without, being able to pick it up and chuck it in the Large Hadron Collider?
Yeah, so the idea of using ancient rocks to look for particles isn't actually that new. It's been around for decades. Basically, anything that interacts with a particle and leaves some sort of trace or signature can be used as a particle detector. It started off with these things called cloud chambers, which were very popular in the 60s and 70s, full of supersaturated water vapor, and the particles would leave these really beautiful tracks. But it's the same principle that we use now with the Large Hadron Collider, as you said, except there the detectors are slightly more sophisticated, working with electrical charge. So physicists have long suggested using rock deposits because particles that move through it, or dark matter if it exists, might leave these tracks, and that would preserve the interaction really well for us to look at. And that preservation includes protons decaying, if they do, into another kind of particle called a kaon, which would leave distinctive paths in rocks like olivine, which exists on the moon. Now, for a long time, we couldn't see these microscopic tracks because our technology wasn't good enough, but that's now changed in the past couple of years, and we're really reaching a point where we might be able to look for them.
Alex, you mentioned sort of the limits of sensitivity on Earth as far as looking for these particles. So why is the moon the better place to look then? I mean, why are those rocks easier to study?
So the big difference between Earth and the moon is that we have an atmosphere, and in this case, our atmosphere is a problem. We have these really high energy cosmic rays smashing into it all the time and producing these showers of high energy neutrinos, which annoyingly mimic the exact atomic pattern that the protons would leave if they decayed. But the moon's lack of atmosphere means that's not a problem up there. We just don't have that same problem.
Look, I love this idea, and I like that you said there was a monetary limitation about doing it on Earth, so they've said, let's go to the moon and do it, as if that's going to be much cheaper. But look, if we are going to go to the moon, we should do science up there, shouldn't we? I mean, NASA has got the Artemis missions that's planned to go up with people by 2026 to land on the south pole of the moon. And then there's all those private ventures too, which we've already heard about a little bit in the show. So look, is this hole on the moon, is it really a realistic contender?
Well, the researchers were very honest when I spoke with them.
They said no.
They said it's a very speculative proposal. You'd need to fly a powerful enough drill up there, first of all. You'd then need to drill down 5 kilometres deep, and then you'd have to bring it back up to the surface and analyse the material on the lunar surface itself. And these microscopy techniques that have been recently developed have never been tested in the lunar environment, so we don't know if they would work in the same way. Now, it's not easy, but one of the big advantages we do have is you wouldn't need much material at all. Just 100 grams of olivine rock from 5 kilometres down would be as sensitive as experiments on Earth that have a $600 million price tag.
Oh, well, that's sold it to me. I mean, that is one reason why the moon and in space, there's loads of good reasons to do science up there.
Yeah, space has loads going for it. For one, it's very cold, which makes it easy to deal with excess heat made from data centres. And there's been loads of recent proposals to move these data centres into orbit or even on the moon.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Jeff Bezos says, isn't it? He wants to put data centres up there. I mean, we've heard about so much energy use is being drained by our increasing use of data. And once you factor AI into it, it's just going to go nuts, basically. Currently, 3% of global energy use is going to data centers. So, yeah, something needs to be done. Whether it's put it all on the moon is another question.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As you said, Jeff Bezos wants to build solar farms and move data centers onto the moon with his space company Blue Origin. And there are also startups looking to move data centers into orbit to save money on upkeep costs that are astronomical down here. Now, the big elephant in the room when it comes to cost is actually sending the stuff into space or orbit, which historically has been very expensive. But Elon Musk with SpaceX, which you'll talk about later in the show, has already shown that spaceflight costs can be significantly reduced.
It was World Environment Day this week, and Madeline Cuff is here to celebrate with us. But I have to say, I'm not sure exactly how to celebrate when we're yet again dealing with less than cheerful climate news. Unless, Maddie, you may have something optimistic for us.
Oh, no, I feel like every time I come on this podcast, I've got something gloomy and serious to say. But unfortunately, this week is no different. There was plenty of news for World Environment Day, but it was all a bit solemn. So firstly, we had a new update on the state of the world's climate in 2023, which was compiled by a team of international scientists. So each year, this group put out, it's kind of a mini IPCC report, and that's the authoritative update on how the climate is changing. This year's release revealed that the world is warming at a record 0.26 degrees Celsius per decade. And if we carry on emitting pollution at current rates, we have just 5 years left of emissions before we blow past the 1.5 degrees temperature goal.
That's a very short period of time in terms of policy and technology changes, Maddie. So we've got rapidly rising temperatures and then a carbon budget that's running dry. Anything else for the heap?
Yeah, I told you it was a bit of a grim selection of news. The report also looked at the Earth's energy imbalance. So that's basically the measure of how much surplus heat there is in the climate system. Basically, it's the difference between how much energy enters the Earth's atmosphere from the sun and how much is radiated back into space.
Which is where we start talking about greenhouse gases, right?
Exactly, yeah. So the Earth has been absorbing more energy than it emits for decades as a result of greenhouse gas emissions. But that imbalance is getting much worse by the year. The amount of heat trapped has doubled since 1993.
And where's all that heat going?
That's a good question. Most of it, around 90%, ends up in the oceans. So as a result, ocean temperatures are rising, which means ocean waters are becoming less effective at capturing CO2 from the air, sea levels are rising, and marine life is suffering.
And of course, we've talked about how unusually warm the oceans have been over even just the last year. Do we have any updates on that?
Yeah, it's an issue we've discussed before on this podcast, the fact that ocean temperatures have been at record highs for the last year. And that's partly because of natural variation in the climate system, but it's also because the oceans are holding ever-growing amounts of heat, which is pushing their baseline temperatures up. And this week, Copernicus, the EU's climate change service, said that sea surface temperatures broke the monthly record for the 14th month in a row. And May 2024 was also the hottest month on record for the 12th month in a row. So really extraordinary streak of record-breaking temperatures we've had on land and in the oceans.
And one thing that even really stood out for me actually was in New Delhi, the heat wave there. There was the wet bulb temperature measurement. So that's a measure of dry heat and humidity put together. That was 38 Celsius or 100 Fahrenheit, which is not as high as the dry temperature, but that means it's basically impossible to live in that. It's above the limit for human survival, and more than 200 people died as a result of that. And that's something that people are really worried about, the wet bulb temperature, and now it's happening. So, where do we go from here?
We this week also had a speech from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who's not known to mince his words when it comes to climate change, he said in response to these new records that the world is on a, quote, highway to climate hell. And that's a line he's used before. But there was a new addition to his script. So as well as his usual calls for governments to do much more to cut emissions and for the fossil fuel industry to transition to greener energy sources, he also, for the first time, called for a tobacco-style ban on fossil fuel advertising. And this is really interesting because it could be quite a significant development. We could see more advert bans like the one that was introduced in Edinburgh a few weeks ago. So that's the city in Scotland has just banned adverts for oil companies and high carbon products like SUVs, flights and cruises. It's super interesting. And Amsterdam actually did something similar back in 2020. So we'll have to wait and see whether this kind of action will start to catch on, but that could really start to shift the kind of cultural needle on these types of high carbon products.
Let's take a quick break. Dead Planet Society episode 5 is coming next week, and it's all about moons. Specifically, how many moons could we put in place before something goes wrong? And that includes moons, which is when a moon has a moon of its own.
How many moons could a moon if a moon could moons? You can look forward to that on Tuesday. And in Culture Lab this week, our resident astronomer Abby Beale talks to astrophysicist Lisa Kaltenegger, who has just published the book Alien Earths, Planet Hunting in the Cosmos, which takes readers on a cosmic adventure. Think faraway exoplanets with oceans of lava and multiple suns, and the extremely practical scientific effort to understand how and where, and of course, if extraterrestrial life might exist. That's in your feed right now.
And we're back. Now, up next, how are your social connections doing these days? Every year, we learn more about the health risks of loneliness and the therapeutic benefits of community. But we're also learning more about the science of how these connections work. So, to hear about that, Christy has been chatting with science writer and former New Scientist journalist David Robson about his new book, The Laws of Connection, The Scientific Secrets of Building a Strong Social Network.
Most of us get just about enough social connection, but many people feel lonely. This has now been part of the US Surgeon General's report on loneliness and the importance of social connection. Various studies suggest that about 50% of people do feel lonely pretty often in their lives. And that's not ideal, especially since social connection is just so good for our health. There's just abundant evidence that having a sense of being socially supported and understood by the people around you, it can change your physiology. That kind of safety you get from knowing that you have like friends and supportive colleagues, it does things like mutes your stress response, and through the kind of mind-body connection that can reduce things like inflammation, which we know is a big risk factor for all kinds of different diseases.
So it's important to our health, and some of us struggle with it, even though in theory we're evolved to socialize.
Right. Like you can blame kind of the loneliness epidemic on modern society in particular. And I'm sure, certain factors do contribute, like people live further away from their families now. Most of us don't end up, living in the village that we grew up in with these people that we've known for so long. But what's really come out of the new research in social psychology is that actually we do have these kind of flawed intuitions, these psychological barriers that prevent us from making the most of all of the opportunities that we do have around us to connect. Like often, the social support that we require is, easily within grasp, but because of these flawed intuitions, we just don't take advantage of that.
What are some of the most exciting frontiers in the research of how we connect at this point? What are we currently sort of expanding our understanding of most rapidly?
I think this really is where the idea of the psychological barriers to connection come in. So I think there'd been so much research in the past that had been questioning, like how sociological factors can influence loneliness. Is it where people are living? Is it how much technology they're using? We've seen, I'd say even in the last 5 years, it's just a recognition of all of these cognitive biases that are leading us to just lose opportunities to connect. And I kind of compared that to what happened in behavioral economics in the 1970s. So it's very well known through the work of people like Daniel Kahneman that we have all of these biases and heuristics that often lead us to make wrong financial decisions, to spend our money when we shouldn't, or to make the wrong investment. But what this new research is showing is how actually we also have a set of biases that are sabotaging our relationships, preventing us from getting that connection that we want. And just by correcting those biases, which are often pretty easy to do using these evidence-based techniques, we can often find that, that connection that we crave is just really close by in the people that you meet, whether they're strangers or whether they're people that are around you. You can just really capitalize on the natural connection that's already there.
Did you come into writing this book fully aware of the best way to be connected to people, or did you find yourself realizing you needed to change some very specific things about how you connected to people?
Yeah, I learned loads from writing the book. To give just one example of something that was very revelatory to me, I discovered this psychological barrier called the liking gap. And that is, put simply, when you first meet someone and you often have a really great rapport, you really respect them, admire them, you find them very funny. People often go away from those conversations feeling sure that they liked the other person more than the other person liked them. We just don't think we're as likable as other people are perceiving us. And that, can be really discouraging from kind of building on that connection that we've already established. So personally speaking, even when I was, working in the office, and I would have colleagues who, would invite me to parties and stuff, and I would just assume they were being kind of just polite, and I wouldn't trust that they really did like me as much as I liked them. So I'd kind of find excuses not to go, because I didn't want to put them in this embarrassing situation. That's just really common. That's what the research shows us. And you can actually know someone for quite a long time, like university students who live together. It takes them about 7 months to overcome the liking gap, and to actually recognize, recalibrate their expectations of how the other person feels about them. So they're having lots of these interactions. And so you can imagine if we actually just know people more kind of vaguely, we might never overcome that liking gap. And that's just such a missed opportunity. So just learning this kind of immediately made me feel a little bit more confident, a little bit braver in my social interactions. It meant that, I was far more likely to kind of take up those invitations or to make the first move myself. Given that the other person is probably experiencing the liking gap too, I can try to reduce those doubts that they have by just making it explicit how I feel, by just telling them how much I'd appreciated the conversation and had enjoyed their company.
That was David Robson talking to Christy about his new book, The Laws of Connection. Check it out and catch his regular column all about science-backed social advice in the magazine.
Now, this week it was announced that 5 children who were born deaf have gained the ability to hear in both ears after receiving a new gene therapy. Michael LePage reported on this for us. Michael, how does this therapy work?
So, this is a gene therapy that's designed to treat people who have mutations in a gene called otophyllin. So there are cells called hair cells in our inner ear that physically detect sounds, and then they have to relay that signal to the brain. The otophyllin protein plays a key role in relaying those signals. If it's defective, the signals from the hair cells don't ever reach the brain. The idea of this gene therapy is to add a working version of that gene back to the hair cells, restoring that link. So the first 6 children were treated in China in 2022. They each had the therapy in just one ear as a precaution in case anything went wrong. Then in 2023, another group of 5 children in China were treated, this time getting the treatment in both ears. And so the results from the second group have just been announced, and that's what I've covered. Meanwhile, at the same time, there's several very similar trials starting up elsewhere. So at least 2 children in the UK and 1 in the US have also been treated.
Got it. And so those 5 children in China can now hear, which to me sounds like this gene therapy is working remarkably well.
Yes, so far it's a great success. One of the first children treated did not see any improvements, but all the others are gaining a considerable amount of hearing. So these latest 5 children, after 6 months, they could all hear voices at a normal conversational level, as we're talking now. They struggle a bit with whispers, one of the researchers told me, but normal voices are fine. And because they've got hearing in both ears, not just one, they can also locate the source of sound. That's a skill that we use without thinking to help us pick out one voice when several people are speaking at once. What's more, the hearing of all of these children is continuing to improve over time, so it could still get a lot better. Of course, there's a big difference between hearing speech and understanding speech. So the older children are when they're treated, the harder it's going to be for them to gain that understanding.
So the second group of children you mentioned, they've been treated in both ears. But what about those who only had one ear treated? You mentioned that first group of children, they only got one treated as a precaution. Will they eventually get the other ear treated too?
Yes, so the issue with this gene therapy is that it's delivered using viruses, and these are injected directly into the inner ear. Now, these viruses are not infectious, but in theory they could provoke a potentially dangerous immune response. So if you treat only one ear, you halve the dose of viruses, reducing the risk of a bad reaction. So all of these trials are starting with one ear only. But yes, the team in China is now planning to go back and try and treat the other ear of that first group of children.
And Michael, so this is just for children that have this mutation in this one gene, the autophyllin gene. So does that mean, the approach won't really work with if you've got multiple mutations that cause other kinds of deafness?
Yes, the problem is that with most of the forms of inherited deafness, the inner ear does not develop normally. So it's not as simple as just adding a single healthy gene. It's going to be a bit more complicated.
Now, we have been talking about this treatment from the perspective of hearing people, as if it's something that all parents would want for any child they had born deaf. But how does the deaf community see this advance, Michael?
There certainly are some people who are deaf who do not see it as a disability and also value deaf culture, so they do not necessarily want their children to be treated to give them hearing. But in this case, it's not really relevant because the parents of these children are hearing. So this is known as a recessive genetic disorder. And what that means is that people who have just one mutated copy of this autophyllin gene can hear fine. But if they have a child with another person who also has a single mutated copy, they've got a 1 in 4 chance of that child getting 2 mutated copies and being deaf. So basically, these are families that are hearing families that have a small chance of having a child with this inherited disorder. And what that means is that these gene therapies are not going to create lots of CODAs. For those who haven't seen the film, CODA stands for Child of Deaf Parents.
Oh, that is such a great film.
Yeah.
I do recommend that if anyone's not seen it.
Many people around the world take antidepressant drugs, particularly a class known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. But many people also at some point stop taking these drugs. And when they do, they may experience some unpleasant effects, which are sometimes called withdrawal symptoms or discontinuation symptoms. Claire Wilson reported on a new study about these effects. Claire, what kind of symptoms are we talking about?
There are actually over 40 different symptoms that fall into this category. They can be physical effects like headaches, nausea, insomnia. Also mental health effects like agitation, anxiety, and mood swings.
Wow, 40 different symptoms.
Over 40.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the mental health ones, though, might they be like a recurrence of the original mental health condition that the person had in the first place that made them start taking the pills?
Yeah, you've put your finger on the big problem there, because in some cases it might be kind of a relapse of their depression or anxiety, but it seems that in some people it's not their underlying mental health condition. It's a reaction to the absence of these drugs, which the brain had sort of got used to, adapted to, and it might take a few weeks for the brain to reset and get back to normal. Now, about 10 years ago even, it used to be more common for doctors to say, if you've restarted experiencing these mood swings, anxiety, that must be your underlying mental health condition reasserting itself. And that means, sorry, you're going to have to take antidepressants for longer. And today, it's much more recognised that those symptoms can be a temporary reaction, and doctors advise people to only stop taking these medicines very gradually, to taper them down under medical advice, and that reduces the severity of the symptoms.
Okay, and so what's this latest bit of research found?
Well, I go into the detail in my piece on this, but basically it's about 1 in 6 or 7 people might have those kind of symptoms.
And it kind of surprises me we're only just finding this out after so long. We've had Prozac Nation and, these pills have been around a long time.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair to the companies, they weren't required to study this kind of thing in order to get approval for their drugs. And of course, it's natural for the companies only to do the trials that they have to do to get approval and get them onto the market. Again, you've put your finger on a kind of a wider debate about whether doctors are over-prescribing antidepressants these days. I mean, it's something like about 1 in 7 people in the UK, for instance, are currently taking antidepressants.
Wow.
They're often prescribed for anxiety, not just depression. And so there are critics who argue that as a society, we have become too reliant on them. Perhaps it's easier to take a psychoactive medication that dulls your emotions than to kind of be able to cope with the various things in your life that make you feel depressed. On the other hand, there are many people who say that antidepressants helped them tremendously when they were in a time of dire need. Some even go so far as to say they might not have survived without them. They warn that we should be careful not to dissuade other people who might really benefit from taking these medicines.
Yeah, just very balanced way of putting it. I can see both sides now you've put it like that.
Yeah, I can too. And what I would say is, at the very least, people who are weighing up the decision as to whether to try antidepressants, they deserve to have up-to-date information about how likely it is that they may have difficulty stopping. And I have spoken with some patients who had tremendous difficulty in stopping these medicines, and they feel angry that they weren't warned about this possibility before they started. So I should say these were people who started them quite some time ago, before withdrawal symptoms were as recognised as they are today. But at least this study has shed some more light on the figures.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Claire. And I should say, because Claire's too modest, she's just won an award. It's the Harding Prize for Trustworthy Communication. Well deserved, Claire.
Claire's award-winning story, which is about DNA testing, is free to read, and we'll put the link in the show notes.
We're going to wrap up with 2 bits of rocket launch news now.
Yes, first of all, Boeing launched its long-delayed Starliner capsule to the International Space Station with 2 NASA astronauts aboard. This successful test now means that there may be 2 companies that NASA can use to send astronauts to the International Space Station.
And then on Thursday, we saw the 4th test launch of SpaceX's Starship. That's the largest rocket ever built, and that's their ongoing project to deliver people to the moon and eventually Mars. And the upshot of that is the Super Heavy booster managed to, perform a controlled landing back to the ocean. And then the upper stage, the Starship itself, also made a controlled landing in the sea. So eventually the company wants to be able to basically bring both those stages back to Earth and reuse them. This was just a test to try and get it through the atmosphere.
That's it for this week. You can read all the stories we've talked about today in the show notes, and there's much more like it on our website, newscientist.com.
Plus, if you like the great stories we're bringing you, do give us a rating or a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Share your favourite stories and tell all your friends.
All of them.
We'll be back next week. All of them.
All of them.
We'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
This podcast is produced by OG Podcasts. Find out more at ogpodcasts.co.uk.